Pull up a chair and I'll talk with you of film and animation, both old and new. Many to choose, many to see, but some I've yet to peruse. There's so much to see in this great world of ours, be they classics homegrown or gems from afar. So join me, friend, and I'll show to you films and animation, both old and new. So much to see, so let's start the show. Sit back, enjoy yourself. The show can't watch itself. Let's bring one down from the shelf. The Highlander franchise has always had a small presence in my life. As a kid, I would occasionally watch episodes of both the cartoon and the live-action series, as they were both in syndication at the time. Now, keep in mind, I did not have cable, so I basically had to watch what was on, and occasionally that was on, and I would passively watch those shows. It wasn't really until high school where I was formally introduced to the franchise, and that was a result of my freshman English class, where I decided to do a book report on the film's novelization. Now, at the time, my high school had a lot of books that had been donated, and because we were a film-centric high school, that included a lot of movie novelizations. And, well, I found it on the shelf. I thought the concept of the franchise looked interesting, so I decided to read it, and I did a book report on it. And then after doing that book report, I decided to check out the film that the novel was based on, and I was immediately enthralled with the story. Now, fast forward a little bit to the summer between my sophomore and junior years in high school. I'd gone on a bit of an anime binge phase where I would go to the library almost every day in the summer, check out an anime, watch it, bring it back, basically trying to watch as many classics as well as obscure stuff, basically trying to get my fix since, well, I was usually by myself at the house during the summer with nary a thing to do. And, well, there was a Blockbuster that was only open for like 3 months because they opened it prior to the company going bankrupt, so it did not last very long. And one day it was having its liquidation sale where they were selling all the DVDs, the shelves, the games. Basically, they were trying to get rid of everything because the company was effectively dead. And naturally, there was a film amongst the others that I bought from that sale that caught my eye. And I was really excited when I first found this because in my mind, it was like, holy crap, a Highlander anime made by the same people who made Vampire Hunter D Bloodlust. This is awesome! And back then, it was. I absolutely loved this film. But now that I revisit it, I realize that I didn't necessarily have the best taste in movies or in anime. And honestly, it's not that the film is flawed, it does have its moments, but it suffers from a lot of the problems that a lot of productions suffered from when they were trying to cash in on the anime craze without really understanding the appeal of anime. The film was a joint production between Davis Panzer Productions, the company behind the Highlander franchise, Imagi Animation Studios, a now defunct Hong Kong animation studio best known for the CG, TMNT, and Astro Boy movies, and Madhouse, the anime studio best known for classics like Ninja Scroll and Trigun, as well as current hits like One Punch Man and Hunter x Hunter. It was written by David Abramowitz, who also worked on the Highlander television series and its subsequent offshoots The Raven and The Source, and directed by Yoshiaki Kawajiri, the director of the aforementioned Ninja Scroll and Vampire Hunter D Bloodlust. The film was an impressive collaboration across continents, animated in Japan, scored and mixed in the US, with ongoing communication between the US and Japanese studios throughout the production. As for how the search for vengeance fits into the rest of the franchise, well, it doesn't. It's a standalone, isolated story, so there's no Connor, there's no Duncan, there's no Quentin MacLeod. It's a reimagination of the core concept of Highlander, which follows an immortal who fights throughout the ages against other immortals who can only die by having their head cut off. As such, we're going to take a look at this film to see how it reinterprets the Highlander mythology and whether or not it makes for a good gateway into the Highlander franchise in all its splendor. The film opens with a text crawl explaining the setting, interspersed with footage from later in the movie to establish that, yes, the character is technically a Highlander. However, it's the bad kind of prologue that needlessly over-explains everything when there are already scenes that explain what happened. It doesn't even really build atmosphere like the classic opening prologue from the original film. The story actually begins as we see our main character, Colin MacLeod, wandering through the ruins of New York, all while a mysterious voice appears to taunt him. Colin comes across a den of the usual ne'er-do-wells that appear in every post-apocalyptic setting, and the scene plays out as you would expect. After cutting a number of them down, he immediately senses the presence of another immortal, Malik, much to Colin's disappointment. This leads to a weird exchange of dialogue that honestly feels a bit out of character.
No one has to die today.
This leads to a moderately impressive but impractical fight scene between Colin and Malik. While it's cool to watch, it comes across as your typical anime fight scene that doesn't really have much logic to it, especially when compared to the fights we get later on. It ends, as most opening fights tend to in Highlander, with the opponent beheaded and the main character inheriting that immortal's power via the quickening. It's here that we meet our villain, Marcus Octavius, whose first appearance shows him jamming on a guitar at the top of his golden tower. After his ripping solo, he and his servant/lover, Kiala, witness the quickening from Colin's fight. Cutting back to the post-quickening destruction, we run into some of the problems of the film, namely the over-expository dialogue and the overall quick pace. Firstly, look at how quickly we fade out from this scene. There's barely any time for the dialogue to sink in. We see this type of thing again and again, making the film feel like just a bunch of stitched-together vignettes. Not to mention that the film rushes us through all of the modern-day story beats that it feels like all the characters and ideas just come out of nowhere. We see this fast pace rear its ugly head when we see Colin arrive at the walled-off segment of Manhattan to collect the bounty for killing Malik. The soldiers then being ordered to bring Colin into the city. After Colin beats the soldiers and escapes, we meet the obligatory eyes and ears character, Joe, who is shown to have been watching the incident from beneath a manhole cover. It is when we get to the bar that the film finally starts to slow down and build up Colin's character, as he's approached by the mysterious resistance leader Dahlia, triggering another staple of the franchise, the flashback to the past, as we see Colin's days among the Celts during the reign of ancient Rome as he prepares his village for an upcoming battle with the Roman Empire. It is here that we also meet Moya, the love of Colin's life and the primary impetus for his actions throughout the film. In a bid to save her people, Moya drugs Colin and sneaks into the Roman compound to seek an audience with Marcus. After initially offering herself as tribute, only to learn Marcus's plan to invade will proceed anyway, Moya proceeds to stab Marcus repeatedly. As she escapes in a rather intense scene, she learns that Marcus is, in fact, not dead, and that her village will be razed to the ground that very night, forced to watch the carnage unfold while hanging from a crucifix. Colin wakes up and attempts to fight, only to be crushed beneath the rubble of his hut. Waking up later, he finds his entire village wiped out and then finds Moya crucified at the top of the hill.
I swear, they will pay for this. I will avenge you all.
We are brought back to modern day as Colin tries to brush Dahlia off, only to then follow her when it's revealed that the soldiers are looking for him. Once again, we rush through some visually uninteresting exposition that tries to speed us along through the modern day plotline, complete with an arbitrary discussion about faith and hope that doesn't really add anything to the story as a whole. At the same time, we are given the backstory of Kiala as we watch her spar against a group of fighters while Marcus conducts his usual business. As the two banter back and forth, we learn that Kiala is also an immortal, having been found by Marcus in 16th century Japan and serving at his side ever since. We rejoin Colin and Dahlia in the underground city as we learn about the mysterious virus that has wiped out most of the population. As the two arrive at Dahlia's place, she immediately tries to seduce him, only to be immediately rebuffed by Colin, who sees right through her plans. As she begs for his help in stealing the vaccine from the city, Colin sees Marcus's face on a jumbotron, sending him into a fit of rage and a flashback to his attempt on Marcus's life in the wake of Moya's death. Marcus decides to face Colin in a duel on horseback, and you can immediately tell right away who is in control, as Marcus mops the floor with Colin and leaves him on the brink of death. He only manages to survive due to his horse riding into the middle of Stonehenge, which is holy ground. For those of you not in the know, the Immortals in the Highlander franchise are bound by a set of rules, 2 rules in particular, when it comes to how they have to fight one another. The first rule, it has to be a one-on-one duel, and the second is that they can never fight on holy ground. This scene does a really good job of establishing that rule without overcomplicating it with exposition. A great deal of time passes before Colin wakes up, his body having healed from the battle with Marcus. This is also where we see Colin meet Amergen, a former druid who serves as the Ramirez for this film, albeit with a radically different dynamic between the two, as Colin is more focused on getting revenge on Marcus despite the constant castigation from Amergen. From there, we are brought back to modern day as Colin learns that Marcus is the man in charge of the city, begrudgingly agreeing to help Dahlia in her mission. As they begin to sneak in, they are joined by Joe, who wishes to get the vaccine for his sister. This leads to a chase sequence that, while cool to look at, only really serves to establish that Colin can use a sword. They make their way into the laboratory, Colin abandoning all sense of subterfuge. As they get to the main research lab, the characters learn that the virus in question was manufactured by them the whole time in order to subjugate the populace. As a plot twist, it is not handled very well. There's just not enough that's been established to allow an audience to actually care what's going on, and as a result, it just feels like it was tacked on for the sake of easy drama. Dahlia and Joe begin to escape, with Colin, sensing Marcus, going off on his own to face him, prompting another lecture from Amergen as we flash back to the fall of Rome in the 5th century, as Colin once again faces Marcus. Now, I do have to say, this is a really cool fight scene. We see just how outclassed Colin is by Marcus, who throughout the battle maintains a calm, stoic demeanor. As he prepares to behead Colin, he is stopped as the other soldiers raid the palace. This leads to my favorite sequence of the film, as we see Colin try and fail to kill Marcus across numerous eras, including the 11th century battle that earned him the MacLeod surname. This sequence is especially effective as we see even Marcus chastise him for his pursuit of vengeance. Meanwhile, back at the plot, Joe and Dahlia make their escape, complete with a "because the Matrix did it" bullet time sequence. Colin goes to face Marcus, once again being beaten with relative ease and sent falling from the top of the tower and crashing to the ground in front of Dahlia and Joe. Colin revives again and explains the situation to Dahlia off-screen as she carries him back home, the two narrowly escaping. This leads to another lecture from Amergen as he explains that Moya had reincarnated throughout history to be with Colin, only to be pushed away as he pursued revenge. It's after this point that the film kind of devolves into your typical post-apocalyptic dystopian story, where the downtrodden people rise up against the military superpower, and honestly, this is where the film kind of starts to go downhill for me. The people of the city, galvanized by the revelation that Marcus was responsible for the virus, gear up for battle despite Dahlia's protests. Meanwhile, Marcus decides to unleash the more deadly strain of the virus the scientists were working on in order to wipe out the population. This also leads to the obligatory love scene. While the image juxtaposition of the candles in the church with Colin and Dahlia's lovemaking is a little on the nose, I find myself more distracted by the animation. I don't know if it's something with the proportions or what, but none of these movements look natural. It's almost like the animators just weren't sure of what they were supposed to draw, and thus they used the images of the church candles and the religious iconography to cover most of it up, which, given what we're seeing, I can't say that I entirely blame them. From there, the battle begins as Marcus's forces roll out and the city folk gear up for a final showdown. Joe leads Colin through another passageway into the city in order for him to get inside. As he sneaks through the complex, he runs afoul of Kiala, who reveals his position, leading to an all-out firefight. As Kiala attempts to run down Colin with her helicopter, Dahlia makes the save, allowing Colin to continue on his way to Marcus. The battle ramps up as all fire is concentrated on the city structure itself. At the same time, Colin and Marcus once again face off. This time, Marcus unleashes the virus at the start of the battle, challenging Colin to beat him before it's dispersed. As Colin tries to stop the machine, Marcus once again defeats him, and the virus is unleashed. At that moment, Dahlia is run through by Kiala, who in turn gets a grenade to the face, destroying them both. Sensing her death, Colin gets his second wind and gets up to face Marcus again, finally beheading him and unleashing the quickening, which destroys not only the virus, but all of Marcus's empire in one fell swoop. Colin wanders away from New York, uncertain of what his future holds as dawn breaks on the newly liberated city. While this film is not the worst thing to come out of the Highlander franchise, it's not one of the best either. Now, it does handle the concept better than some of the live-action films, but the film has its own fair share of problems. The visual style, while interesting to see at first glance, lacks any real heart or emotion. The fight scenes were enjoyable, but aside from the two major fight scenes between Marcus and Colin in ancient Rome, they are lacking in any real choreography, opting for a more stylized and flashy approach that doesn't really care too much about the physics of the fighting, with certain motion choices that felt arbitrarily added on. Many elements of the story, primarily in the present day setting, aren't really given enough depth or exploration to allow an audience to get invested. We are taken through those plot points so quickly that the film feels like a paint-by-numbers post-apocalyptic sci-fi anime like so many other films before it. Sadly, the biggest problem with The Search for Vengeance is that it's lacking in any real heart or emotion that ties everything together. And that's a shame because there are elements of this film that I like. Firstly, Marcus is a really cool Highlander villain. If the Kurgan was an agent of chaos and anarchy, Marcus Octavius was an agent of order and authoritarianism. He knew to bide his time as various empires rose and fell until he was finally in a position to build his own version of Rome. Compared to the more outlandish villains the franchise has produced, his aloof demeanor made him a force to be reckoned with. He was calm, cold, calculating, all of which made him the perfect villain for someone like Colin, who is acting purely on emotion. As for the larger theme of time that's lost to the pursuit of vengeance, it works perfectly for a franchise like Highlander, where you have characters that live for centuries. It helps set the stage for just how hollow the pursuit of vengeance can leave a person, hitting home as we see the inside of Colin's head and how the only thing in his mind is his grief for Moya and his lust for revenge. Overall, this film is just a middle-of-the-road sci-fi anime that just happens to have the Highlander name stamped on it. Now, it's not without its good ideas, but it doesn't really put in the due diligence needed to make those ideas work. Instead of a feature, if this was an OVA miniseries with more time to tell its story, it probably would have been executed a lot better, but as is, it's just okay. If you're a fan of Highlander, you could do a lot worse than this, as it's definitely better than the source. Or Zeist. However, it pales in comparison to the heart and emotion that's present in the original film, or the mythological depth that you get from the television series. If you're an anime fan looking to get into Highlander, it's an okay starting point, but you're probably better off looking at the original film, since the story in the original is more fleshed out and you're given more time to get invested in the characters. Not to mention that the core concept of the franchise, the gathering of the immortals, isn't even really present in The Search for Vengeance. Honestly, the film is probably best enjoyed by people who are either diehard fans of the Highlander franchise, or people who are fans of the work of Yoshiaki Kawajiri, so if you liked Ninja Scroll, you'll probably enjoy this film. But outside of those niche demographics, I can't really give a wholehearted recommendation. It's entertaining to watch, but it's not the kind of film you need to rush out to see, so if you're able to stream it, or if you're able to borrow it from a library, well, then yeah, it's enjoyable for what it is for that brief amount of time, but you don't have to buy like any special edition or even a full $20 copy. I got this brand new copy from Amazon for like $8, that's about a fair price for it. On that note, let's go to the shelf and see what it can offer us. You know, we've been looking at a lot of genre stuff on this show, and honestly, I think it's time that we've had a bit of a palate cleanser. And given that our nation is currently facing a tumultuous time, I feel it's appropriate that we take a look at one of the darker parts of our nation's history that, let's face it, we're kind of on the verge of repeating. Next time on From the Shelf.